We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent, and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani saltwater peoples of the Margaret River in our west, to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nioni peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
What is going on? Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Good evening for those of us joining us from down under. My name's Jane Masters. I'm a Master of Wine, and it gives me great pleasure to be moderating this session today, which is entitled South Australia, Leading Sustainability Down and Under. We have 6 great wines to taste today. From 5 different regions within South Australia, and we'll be talking to some of the guys behind those wines about the wines themselves, about their plans for sustainability. Before I go ahead with any of that, though, I'd just like to do a few bits of housekeeping. First of all, this session will actually be recorded, so for any of you that want to review, maybe missed something and want to go back, it will be available to you and to anybody that wishes to see it. Second thing is there is a great booklet that the Wine Australia team have produced for the session today. It's got the list of wines in there. It's got some great information about the Sustainable Winegrowing Australia scheme, as well as each of the regions and the estates and the wines that we'll be tasting. We'd like to keep, or I'd like to keep this a fairly interactive session, so it's not going to be so much questions and answers as a sort of fluid discussion amongst the panelists, myself, And hopefully you guys, if you have any questions, please just type them into the Q&A section. I will try and keep an eye on the questions as they come in and ask them at the appropriate time. But I know that I have the team, Wine Australia team, also keeping an eye on that. So we will try and get everything answered. So please do send in your questions. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have one amendment to make, I'm afraid. Sue Hodder sends her apologies. She's not able to join us today. She's not feeling too well. So Sue, we wish you all the best and hope you're feeling better very soon. And then I'd like to introduce Melissa Brown, who is Chief Viticulturist from Gemtree Wines. Giles Cook, who is from Thistledown in the Riverland. And sorry, I skipped over Malcolm. I shouldn't have done that. Sorry, I was going to say Malcolm Lest from Hither and Yon, who is also in McLaren Vale. So Melissa and Malcolm, obviously, great neighbours. Giles from a bit further away in the Riverland, hot, dry region, which we'll, I'm sure, be talking about. Nigel Blisky from viticulturist at my Torbreck Vintners. Sorry, my brain's not working on a Monday morning. Probably one too many glasses of wine over the weekend. And finally, Clinton Taylor from Wakefield Wines in Clare Valley. So before I go over any further and launch the conversation, I just thought I'd give a few thoughts myself on sustainability and what it means to me, because it obviously means different things to different people. But for me, essentially, being sustainable means basically being able to continue what you are already doing. So in this case, making high quality wines. And for business, for a sustainable business, it means that they can continue operating. And that means that they have the resources, the people, and the skills necessary to continue doing what they do. And in terms of producing high quality wines, that means the natural resources that we use, the land, the soil, the water resources, the vines themselves are very important, and these need to be looked after, they need to be replenished, they need to be nourished so that they are they're not only producing great quality grapes for great wines now, but they are going to be able to do that in the future. Sustainable business also needs people, and in particular, vineyards need specific expertise in the vineyard. Wineries need winemaking experience. And given that many wineries are in fairly sort of remote regions, I think one of the challenges is how do we, as a wine business, encourage younger generations to come and work in those regions, and how do we retain people and pass experience on from one generation to another, experience which is so important when it comes to making high quality wines. And finally, to be sustainable, a business needs to make money. It obviously needs to have funds in order to pay for its operations, to pay its staff, and also to invest in the future. So we can clearly see that sustainability has three aspects to it: the environmental aspect, the social aspect, and the economic aspect. In other words, people, planet, and profit. Sorry, my phone's dinging. Switch that off. And these three pillars are all very much interconnected, but they're not the only thing that is important. We also need to be aware of what's happening in the world outside us, and there's a lot happening in terms of climate change. We know that climate generally in all regions around the world is leading to warmer daytime and nighttime temperatures, which obviously has an impact on the vines and their growing season. It's also leading to more extreme weather events more frequently. So whether that's extended periods of drought, higher heat wave temperatures, issues with frost, with heavy rainfall and flooding, all of these things are a symptom of climate change. Currently, the Earth's average surface temperature has increased by 1.2 degrees centigrade, and governments, people, businesses around the world have committed to capping that increase at 2.5 degrees centigrade. And basically that means that we have to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and hit zero emissions by 2050. So that's quite a challenge. The Australia wine and grape industry has committed itself to zero emissions targets and is currently developing a roadmap around that. We also know that consumers themselves are very conscious and aware, concerned about climate change, as well as they are about other aspects of sustainability, whether it's the environment in terms of biodiversity, waste, pollution, all of those things. But they're also concerned about social aspects in terms of diversity and inclusion, fairness in the workplace. So all of these things are important to our consumers. And we're going to be talking about the Sustainable Winegrowing certification scheme today. But I think this is a great system that not only can give consumers confidence in the wines that they're choosing to buy having been made as sustainably as possible, but also that the producers and the members of that scheme get access. They report on a number of factors every year on greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable practices across 6 different areas, which include land and soil, waste, energy, water, biodiversity, people and business. And I think in reporting in that way, it also gives the members visibility of how they're tracking against their peers and other equivalent winemakers and wineries, and helps them identify areas for improvement. So I think it's a scheme that's comprehensive, and we'll be discussing that more. We will move on to talk with each of the speakers. Just a quick, I would say, a quick comment on Australia being, one of the warmest, one of the driest climates that wines are currently being made in, and without access to irrigation in certain regions, viticulture would never have been possible in the first place. And actually, we saw on the video just now, South Australia has a long heritage and history of making wine, but a lot of that was made viable because of pioneers going back to the 19th century developing irrigation systems. But today, perhaps things with water and resources are slightly different. We'll be talking again about that. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to ask Melissa, please, to kick us off really with at Gemtree Wines, your vineyards, I think, started being farmed conventionally. You then moved on to organic viticulture, and now you are practicing biodynamic viticulture. So could you just give us a feeling about an understanding of your journey along that path?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Jane. So I'm third generation grape grower, and my grandfather and my dad were very much conventional farmers, and I felt that we would get a better result farming our vineyards more naturally. So that came just from a personal belief, and I had to convince Dad that was a good thing to do. That was back in sort of the mid 2000s, and I guess looking back, it was a really good decision. I mean, climate change wasn't a thing sort of back then. So it was a complete change in the way that we thought about how to farm our vineyards. We had to bring all of our staff along with us because, if everybody sort of didn't have skin in the game, it wasn't going to work. And it was a huge learning curve. So I think we made a lot of mistakes in the beginning, but I certainly don't.
Can I just ask you, what was it that made this was a sort of personal conviction? What was it that really made you want to go down this direction in the first place? As you say, now it's sort of we're all talking much more aware of climate change and much more aware of practices in the past that perhaps we felt were the right things to do, but now know that they have some downside to them. So what was it that drove you down this direction?
So it actually, I went to a health retreat, so it was a very personal thing, and the health retreat was a very life-changing experience for me, where I wanted to minimise the toxic load on my own body, on my family, and I started growing organic veggies and things at home. And then there was this real disconnect between how I was living my life and what the practices we were using at work. So I knew that there had to be a big change. And then Mike attended so Mike is my husband and our winemaker. So he attended a Shiraz workshop in the Barossa Valley. He went to a workshop on biodynamic wines, came back from that and said they were amazing. Like, would you consider this way of farming? And to me, it really resonated with me. Bio means life, dynamic means energy, life and energy, more natural farming. To me, it just all resonated, and yeah, we went for it.
Great. So you were talking about shifting from conventional to organic, where you reduce the amount of pesticides or other chemicals that you're using, moving towards less synthetic chemicals, and now you're going on to biodynamic farming. Do you produce all your own composts and your own?
Yep. Yes, we do. So biodynamics is kind of trying to keep that closed loop and minimise outside intervention. So yeah, we do. We take the waste from the winery or the grape mark, and we make our own compost every year. And we into that we add some more green waste, some animal manures, and yeah. So we're taking that waste product and we're putting it, making it a usable thing and putting it back out into the vineyard, and that's a big part of our fertilizer regime.
Great. And can you actually say that can you taste a difference in the grapes and the wines that you make, having moved from organic to biodynamic?
I think we can now. It did take some years before we really started to see some differences, and that's because it was a very high input conventional farm before we converted. So there was pre-emergent herbicides, there was a lot of superphosphate. It was all happening. So I think it probably took about 7 or 8 years before we really started to see some change in the wine. It's really, I think you can see it now. And it was also a change in winemaking style. So I think Mike used to use a lot more oak and was sort of chasing a different style, whereas now we're really looking for that varietal expression, and really approachable wines are the wines that we're trying to make.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to the wine then. So we're tasting Fiano 2022. So this latest vintage, and I think one of the questions I said to you last week when we had a quick chat was, we're talking Australia, we're talking high temperatures potentially, although obviously you've got this diurnal shift between day and night. But it's like, yeah, we're talking about climate change. So why white wine? Why Fiano? Why have you chosen this variety?
Sorry, I'm in the dark. I'm just going to move because I'm near a sensor light. Hang on. Sorry about that, Jane. So we've gone with for Fiano because we think that it's similar to where it's grown in Sicily and Campania in Italy, that they have a very similar climate to us in McLaren Vale. So we're coastal, we've got that Mediterranean climate, and we were looking for a variety that tolerates heat really well and that is drought resistant. So that's why and also people can pronounce it, and it's a really beautiful drink. I like white wines that have a bit of acidity, and Fiano has that. So yeah, it just seemed like my dad planted Chardonnay back in the sort of the 80s and the 90s, and now we needed to find a variety more suited to a warming climate, and so that's why we chose Fiano.
They're delicious. So perhaps I can then move on to Malcolm, because you're not very far away. You're also McLaren Vale. We're going to taste a rosé that you produce in a sec. Before that, perhaps Malcolm, you can talk to us a little bit about regenerative agriculture, because I understand that's what you're doing there in the vineyard, and I think it would be really interesting. First of all, if perhaps you could, not everybody I think is fully up to speed on what regenerative agriculture actually means, but perhaps you could explain that a little bit to us.
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to load a slideshow here as well, which will just sort of give you some visuals around what we're doing. I'm trying to do that. Perhaps Lucy, can you help me with that? Anyway, as a way of background for us, Jane, my brother Richard and I started Hither and Yon with our wives Sharon and Kelly in 2011, and we're really lucky. We're quite like Melissa's family. Our parents started growing here in the late 70s, and up until we started Hither and Yon, in fact, we're pretty much just growers. So I suppose we didn't have the connectivity to the marketplace that sort of was issuing the trend signals that are very clear now. But the main purpose for starting Hither and Yon was around climate change, and in particular the opportunity to improve our environment at home, but also the opportunity to talk about the beauty and diversity of McLaren Vale as well. So regenerative agriculture is actually our main purpose every day now. We've been on a journey like Melissa and Mike and Team Gemtree have been on, but we've really landed on regenerative, and we've been practicing that really strongly since 2017. The primary purpose is actually about water storage and capacity and depth in our soils. So trying to maximise all the natural rainfall that we're getting, or what we're getting less of. So increasing soil microbial diversity, having what we call living roots all year round in our soils. This is my brother Richard in Sand Road Vineyard. This is a block of Torbreck Nacional, and this is spring last year actually. So what we're seeing here is that we've got a really well covered soils here from a multi-species cover crop. No cultivation, obviously, no till, no synthetics or chemicals there. The aim ultimately is to do as little as possible or do nothing out there in a good way. Like Melissa was saying before, I think variety choice for us is going to be key, and it has been. We're 22 varieties across 6 sites now, with climate change very strongly in mind. Regen Ag's also not just about the productive zones, but it's also about non-productive zones. So here's just a little photo of a natural corridor. We're restoring ecology and doing revegetation across all of our vineyard sites. So we've got a biodiversity action plan for each of our sites. So, currently planting around 2,000 to 3,000 native grasses, shrubs, trees each year. This is around, obviously, creating pollination zones, which are good for vineyard health, but also helping with pest and insect control in the vineyards as well. Apart from that, we're obviously reducing erosion and capturing as much of that rainfall through these lovely corridors and creeks as well. Livestock's really important in regen ag. For us, we're maybe a little bit different in that we prefer cattle. So been really lucky that the family's been breeding and raising and grass feeding Black Angus cattle now for close to 25 years. And since we've been doing regen ag, we've been bringing these lovely animals through the vineyards and having a bit of a mixed use on all of our properties. So from a vineyard perspective, we don't just see them as mowers either. We intensively graze and rotate frequently in the vineyards with the cattle. That's obviously to help keep grass down, but it's also helping to concentrate manure and fix nitrogen and nutrients in the soil. But we're not overgrazing to the point where we're leaving the soil bare. We're leaving enough large leaf area that obviously the photosynthesis will occur that helps keeping pumping carbon back into our soils as well. They're lovely to have out there as well. From a Sustainable Winegrowing Australia perspective, we're obviously a really proud member there. We're from a wine business perspective and across all of our 6 vineyards. So to your point earlier, Jane, this is about essentially next generation thinking for us. That's me and my son Abel there. And what we're really hoping, like Melissa said, is that we're involving our people in all of the ecosystem of sustainability. That's sort of helping drive some really good culture and innovation and change in our business. And I think it's a really wonderful community that we're involved in McLaren Vale and South Australia around this as well. It's certainly providing a valuable trust mark for our brand when we go into overseas markets as well. From a wine perspective, we're really lucky that we get to make our wine at Gemtree. So we are just around the corner, literally. So we're really proud of that. And obviously the winery there is very well tuned into the Sustainable Winegrowing Australia winery perspective. So it just really allows winemaking style to be very much sort of trusting of that lovely vineyard environment that we've got. It's pretty cool and open and a little bit like the vineyard. We're not trying to do too much in the winery there, just express variety and vineyard geology in place really, really clearly and make these lovely, bright, fruit-forward wines. One thing that is maybe a little bit different for us currently is that we are a carbon neutral wine brand and organisation. So this is with Climate Active, which is the Australian government's collective action for climate change. So we've been carbon neutral now for 2 years. I guess, from my perspective, Richard does all the outside work, regen ag in the vineyard, and this is the strategic or business side of what we do, which is a big part of my role. And I think it takes what regen ag does beautifully around soils and building and storing carbon, and then taking it into something that we can baseline and measure and continuously improve upon each year.
Malcolm, on that point, that's a really interesting point. So all the things that you're doing in terms of no-till, encouraging year-round crop cover, soil cover, do you actually measure the carbon content in the soil? Does that demonstrate that you are actually capturing and sequestering carbon? in that way?
Yeah, we are, Jane, and this is quite new in Australian agriculture in terms of, I guess, what is a micro environment from our perspective in terms of measuring. So apart from the visual and the practical farming aspect of what we can see, and there's a lot of balance and really nice yield around what we're doing, we're certainly seeing a lot of good benefits from soil carbon increase, and also back to that water holding capacity as well, and certainly lessening the need for irrigation come the drier parts of the season as well. So ultimately our aim there is obviously from capturing carbon in the soils and measuring it, and then also creating offsets with biodiversity projects and tree planting, is that we'll be very much on a net zero path. What we can control at the moment is around our emissions and trying to bring those down, and then any offsets that we're doing in a very community local partnership mindset as well. Hopefully that answers your question, Jane. Sorry.
It does indeed. I think I'm going to have to hurry you a little bit if you want to show your last few slides, and then we need to just touch on the wine itself.
Yeah, so the carbon neutral piece goes through to product, where we're looking for improvements and enhancements and sort of challenging our suppliers and value chain there as well. And to the lovely wine, which I think Aglianico, like Melissa said about Fiano, when we're thinking about a future climate appropriate variety, which is also delicious to drink, great to grow. Aglianico's certainly that. We planted in 2008, so I've got sort of good natural balance out in the vineyard now. We pick early for this lovely dry, almost sort of grapefruit pithy, tangy, traditional style rosé, and then the vineyard gets left for another 6 to 8 weeks, and we can make a savoury, punchy, really food-friendly red as well. So very adaptable variety.
We have a question here, or a comment more than a question, but from Brad Horn, who says, we see more and more Mediterranean varieties coming to the fore from South Australia. Is that just climate change, and those varieties better at coping with heat and drought? And I think both you and Melissa sort of alluded to that in what you've been saying. And I guess when we come on to talk to Giles about that, perhaps you can pass a comment or two as well, Giles. There was one other thing quickly before we move on from, I think it was from Rosemary, asking about how much less water does Fiano need in the vineyard compared to Chardonnay? Melissa, do you have any comments on that? Is there a difference?
Look, it is definitely more drought tolerant than Chardonnay. You're actually drinking only the second vintage of Fiano there that we've made. So I would say that it has less of a water requirement, but to be honest, the last 2 years here in McLaren Vale, we've had reasonably wet years. So it's a bit difficult for me to honestly say at this point in time, but I'm hoping that it is more drought tolerant than Chardonnay.
And I think your point about it's been wet years, because I think I've said several times this morning already, climate change is bringing it more extended, longer periods of drought, but actually what it's also bringing is a lot more volatility from one year to the next, much less predictable than sort of previous years, which has its own challenges.
Exactly. And I think that's one of my biggest concerns, is the unpredictability of the weather patterns now. And it's things like hailstorms in spring and frost, which didn't used to be a problem in our region. And or the fact that 2 or 3 years ago we had a 42-degree day in November during flowering. It's those sorts of things that are really starting to have an impact, I think.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions about carbon neutral. So Malcolm, if you wanted to show your last slide and any of other comments about how much extra work, I'm going to ask you to be really, really quick, and we'll potentially come back at the end if you want to say more, but how much extra work is to be carbon neutral beyond being sustainable, or does being sustainable pretty much include being carbon neutral? Well, I would actually say, from my point of view, I think as a whole world, we need to try and get to bring greenhouse gas emissions down, because otherwise climate change is going to accentuate and become more and more unpredictable and more extreme and more difficult to do things for all of us. So I don't know whether you want to add anything else to that before we move on, Malcolm.
I'll just say quickly, I think being Sustainable Winegrowing Australia certified is a great start, but that's just the beginning of a pretty long road for carbon neutrality. Yeah. But you have to start, and you're better off doing that than not. So
and I think that is a point as well. It's like sustainability, you never get to an end point. Sustainability is an ongoing thing because everything keeps changing around us. So it's something that you strive for, but never actually fully achieve. Giles, I'm going to move on to you. I'm hoping, I know you had a few technical hiccups a bit earlier when we were in the waiting room, but hopefully we can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. That's brilliant. And so Giles,
great.
Thistledown wines based in the Riverland, probably, well, actually, if you look at the data in the
actually based in the Adelaide Hills. Yes.
Right. But you're talking about wine from the Riverland.
We're talking. Yeah, we source fruit from all over South Australia, and do quite a lot up in the Riverland. But yeah, I actually spend as much time where these guys have just been talking about McLaren Vale as the Riverland. But
perfect. But I am going to ask you to talk about Riverland today. So
yeah, I know.
And the fact that, you know, if we look at this data in here, well, Riverland is clearly the warmest region, the driest region. It's the region I guess I was alluding to at the beginning when I said there are some regions in Australia that unless you had irrigation in the, you know, it would just, agriculture generally just would have been very, very hard indeed. So perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about, can you give us a sense of, okay, we've got this average growing season temperature of 23.5 degrees centigrade, but what does that actually mean in terms of during the summer? You know, Melissa just talked about hitting 42 degrees in spring during flowering, which is obviously very extreme. But what happens in Riverland during growing season temperature wise?
Yeah, well, the mean average temperatures during the growing season are somewhere between 30 and 32 degrees. But obviously there's heat spikes like the rest of South Australia does. Some of them have been pretty extraordinary in the last few years. I think on one occasion it did get pretty close to 50. But it would not be uncommon, obviously, to get up into the low to mid 40s, and during heat spells like that, then the nighttime temperatures are not going to get much below 20 degrees. But on average, it's more like 30 to 32, and then evening temperatures get down to about sort of 13 to 15.
So irrigation.
So it's hot.
It's hot, and irrigation's obviously been important to keep those vines sort of being able to produce grapes and keep them alive. But I guess irrigation is also a tool that we need to use to try and help combat some of those very high extreme temperatures at times. But at the same time, water resources can be under more pressure than they ever have been before. So is there a difference now in Riverland as to how people view water as a resource? You know, I remember years and years ago seeing sort of people just overhead sprinklers just pumping away and sort of water everywhere. That doesn't happen these days, does it? Or does it?
It still does. It still does, but not so much. I mean, I guess, look, necessity is the mother of invention, and I think as a result of that, the Riverland, particularly South Australia's Riverland, is really well set up for irrigation. The first irrigation trusts were set up in 1893 in Renmark, and have been developing ever since. And more recently, there's been an awful lot of investment put in by local and Commonwealth governments. And we've moved away from sort of the open channel irrigation of the past, which is obviously prone to lots of leaks and evaporation. And pretty much everything in South Australia's Riverland is now in pressurized pipes. So it's protected from evaporation. And it means that all of the growers have really high levels of control over the amount of water that they're actually using. And that's now tapping into the use of satellites and telemetry, combined with continuous capacitance probes, so that continually monitoring water levels in their vineyards, so that they're able to really adjust water onto the vine to the bare minimum that's required to grow the crop that they need to economically.
Yeah, and I think as part of Sustainable Winegrowing Australia, there are, you do monitor, I think one of the indices that you have to fill as being a member is the amount of water that you're using, and then you can see how you compare with neighbouring vineyards. So it's that precision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of stuff. Yeah. Sorry, time lag.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. Maybe I'll ask you the question about your wine and these Mediterranean grape varieties that could you perhaps pass comment on how you view, tell us about your wine here, first of all, the Montepulciano.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first reason we moved up into doing stuff in the Riverlands, it was chasing old vine Grenache, actually, because we're passionate about that subject, and in terms of improving the sustainability and the long-term potential for the variety. But in doing so, we started working with Ashley Ratcliffe, who's one of the pioneers of the Mediterranean varietals up in the Riverland, and Ash works as a viticultural consultant for us. And he's got a huge array of alternative varieties planted now around Barmer and Berry. So we started working with him on Grenache, but really loved what he was doing in terms of some of these other varieties. And we wanted to set up something which was more about sort of really young, fresh, crunchy styles, really versatile wines for the market. And both Nero and Montepulciano fulfilled that brief. They've been planted, I think the Nero is about 15 years old, and the Monte is about 9 years old now. And there's definitely the aspect that they're more drought tolerant than some of the other varieties that have traditionally been planted in the Riverland. But for me, I think one of the biggest benefits that they have, particularly in the Riverland, which has been known for growing high yield commercial varieties, is that they can actually be grown at lower yields and make a commercially viable crop. But because they're still in very high demand, unlike Shiraz and Cabernet and Chardonnay to an extent, they can be grown at much, much lower yields, which means that just by default, the water usage is so much lower. And okay, I think that this is an incredibly important point. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions on water whilst you're on the subject. So Rosemary Brown is asking, what is the bare minimum of water needed for a hectare of vines in Riverland? I guess that's a tricky one to answer because it does depend on so many different factors, temperature during the day and lots of different things. But do you have any sort of...
I think I'd only be fair in saying I'll come back to you on that one.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky
I'll
one.
maybe get Ash, the actual grower, to answer that. It's got so many variables.
Yeah, and then Joe Wodzak. Hi, Joe. Giles, with the relentless increase in temperature,
Hi,
is
Joe.
salination my screen moved as I was reading it there. Is salination in the Riverland and the Murray Delta becoming a worse problem than it was before? He says, I remember it being raised as an issue 20 years ago. So I think irrigation generally can lead to, or over irrigation, if it's not done in the right way, potentially can lead to soil salination. Perhaps one of the other viticulturists might want to talk to that a little bit about, does regenerative, does the biodynamic help with some of that?
Jane, I might make a comment.
Yeah, well, no, okay.
Oh, so I was going to say huge change in irrigation practices in the Riverland. A lot of drip irrigation used now, a lot of automation, so a lot of watering it at night. So probably, if anything, that in the past there was overhead irrigation that was really done in big areas, whereas now the way the irrigation is set up, it's more dependent on smaller blocks, and you can irrigate with drip irrigation far more precisely. So rather than watering a massive area, you now water pretty much under the vine. So salinity is probably way less of an issue than it used to be. And the use of rootstocks in the Riverland is really high. So you've got a lot of drought tolerant rootstocks. So the amount of water, there's probably a few years ago, it might have been 6 or 7 megalitres a hectare. You're probably half of that now. And again, depends on the soil type as well. Deeper sands, you've got a lot more soil. So I would say far and away, guys like Ashley, during the drought, we learn a lot about managing in very dry conditions, and we've got a heck of a lot better at doing it.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. Giles, just one last thing. We had a question that was sent in before the webinar from Hannah. Could you explain in more detail what is your low intervention approach to winemaking and to preserve individuality and terroir? I also had a question actually on something that I read that you wrote. You had written, that you pick on the way up. I'm not sure that I understand what that actually means. Could you perhaps give us a couple of words on that?
Yeah, I mean it's something philosophy which developed whilst working with Grenache, and I guess it was a response particularly to that variety, which we followed through to pretty much everything else that we're doing. In the past, I think everybody would accept quite often we were maybe picking some varieties a little bit too late. Some of that was about whether they had any value, and in terms of everything else came into the winery first. And particularly with Grenache, which used to be probably the lowest priority variety for many people. As a result of that, it used to sit out there too long. The wines that were then made from fruit that was slightly overripe weren't that attractive, and as a result of that, nobody bought them. So when we started out, and obviously there's a lot of other people doing it now, we knew that to create more of a market, which would then allow us to pay the growers more, and those vines would be kept in the ground, we had to change the style of the wines that were made. And that meant changing the picking times and changing growers' expectations of when they would pick. So picking on the way up for me is essentially shorthand for spending an awful lot of time in the vineyard in the weeks before vintage, tasting extensively. And what I'm looking for is not for the fruit to be super ripe on the vine. I'm looking for all of those signs that the fruit is just coming up to what I would perceive as ripeness. And that's not necessarily the every single berry. I'm just looking for those precursors, rather than waiting until I see it's perfectly ripe, and then by the time you've picked it, got it into the winery, it's kind of gone over. We want to preserve all that freshness and that brightness. And for me, that also means that you can do an awful lot less in the winery as well. And I think that's something that a lot of people have changed over the last 10 years. The perception of what is truly ripe fruit has changed because we want to make wines that have got less ads in the winery, but also in terms of consumer profile. People want fresher, brighter, more energetic wines. And I think in many ways that really ties in with the subject, in that you pick fruit a little bit earlier, it's generally healthier, you can do less to it in the winery as well. So that's what picking on the way up means to me.
Perfect, thank you. Just one quick question then from Marcus, asking about the residual sugar in this particular wine. Is there some residual in that? Doesn't say in the booklet, so
no,
it's dry. Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Nigel. Nigel from Torbreck.
Hello.
Hi. So, well, I guess that the vines that we're talking about here in your old vine Grenache from the Hillside Vineyard are probably some of the oldest in this lineup of wines. So, according to my notes, planted in 1949. So quite a long time ago. So talk about sustainability. They've been around and been sustained. They're dry farmed. I guess one of the challenges is, okay, so is climate change actually affecting the way in which you have to think about and manage those vines now? Is dry farming becoming more risky?
Oh, yes, definitely becoming more risky. I mean, one of the wonderful things about working with old vineyards, and at Torbreck we work with, around 25 hectares of vineyard that's older than 80, and about 10 hectares that is older than 100. And one of the things that we really see is that a lot of these vineyards are planted on really good soils, and the Hillside site's one of those sites. But when you go and look into my background was in soil science, so I came to viticulture from an environmental science background, and really, so soils is my thing. When you look at these soils, they're actually got high organic matter. They've got good soil structure. So one of the things that we look at Torbreck is about trying to maintain and replicate those conditions. So looking at when you don't have irrigation, you really don't have a lot of choice. So you really do have to maximise the potential that you have, not only in where the vines are growing, the end use that you get for the wine. So when we looked at these old vineyards, we looked at the soils and thought, well, this is our main asset. And we know that adding organic matter and these sort of things help hold water holding capacity, soil structure. So yes, we really started at the bottom up and looked very much how we manage those vineyards. And so it was really quite a logical step to look at sustainable management, and we're more regenerative farming than anything. So again, we probably take we try to take the best out of organic and inorganic viticulture. But again, I'm going to show a few slides here.
Could you just explain that last comment, what you mean by it then? What are the best bit, the best bits?
I think,
again,
the
best bits of inorganic.
We don't use any inorganic fertiliser. We don't, we might use it. Being dry grown, competition is probably one of our biggest risks in terms of maintaining productivity and getting good vine growth. So we would, we're trying to, so the competition, so sometimes we would use one herbicide a year, for instance, and that allows us to maintain, the vineyard without too much competition. Because through 19 and 20, you talked a lot about how climate variability, this is the hardest thing for us to manage. In 19 and 20, we had half our average rainfall. Yields dropped off the Hillside Shiraz, dropped from 17, 18 tonnes down to about 3. So that really does affect your profitability and the sustainability of that management. Hang on, I'm trying to show some photos. So again, we would try and use the tools that we have available to us to actually get the best out of these vineyards. So if you look at the picture I've just put up, that's about 160 cubic metres per hectare of organic compost. So that by putting compost in, limiting the amount of growth, we've also gone, like we, over a few years, we sowed down about 107 hectares of mid-row sward. So we're really trying to not do any cultivation. We're trying to, put a diverse species into the mid-row. So we're looking at a whole range of things. Mulching has been a big part of what we do. As you can see there, we've got we're trying to limit the amount of bare earth that we have around our vines. When we do our mulching, we can certainly see a huge saving in water in our irrigated vineyards as well as our dry grown vineyards. So 40% saving on water. So that's a big part of understanding what we're doing. One of the other things
is, just so that I understand, is that saving water because it stops the evaporation of water from the soil, or?
Yes, it does. It does. It stops evaporation, and it becomes a bit of a buffer as well between the soil and if we put herbicide, there's a buffer over the soil. So I mean, we're trying to limit the amount of herbicide that we can, and we've invested in a lot of technology under vine weeders and mowers. So we're always looking to try and improve our techniques, hence trying to take different approaches. I guess one of the other things we do a lot of, we also use sheep in our vineyards rather than cattle. So this is really, we find that we can save 2 tractor passes during winter by using grazing in the vineyard. We're lucky to have it's quite a mixed farming area where we are. So it's very easy for us to get our neighbours' sheep in, and they chew the vines, the grass down, and allow us not to use another herbicide during winter, and also we don't have to do a tractor pass. So again, compaction is a big part of trying to avoid any tractor passes help that. So we're using a range of techniques, but that variability is really difficult to manage, particularly when you go from in 19 and 20 we had lots of very hot conditions up to 46 degrees. And then to last year we had no temperatures over 40 degrees and only had 2 38-degree days. So you really have to be able to manage, you have to react very quickly in a changing climate.
So, and I guess, earlier on I was saying vineyards, we need expertise in vineyards and in wineries actually, but that variability, I guess, having people that have, obviously you're there as chief viticulturalist, but it's important also to have people that are actually spending their days working in the vineyards up to speed. That whole sort of people aspect in terms of getting the right skills, making sure that you've got experience handed down from one generation to the next, so that we know that in the future it will be there. What sort of are there initiatives that you're actually doing at Torbreck with respect to that?
Yeah, at Torbreck we're involved with a project called the Concordus Project through the Foundation Barossa. So we make some wine, and we actually the proceeds from that wine go towards a scholarship. So at Torbreck we have 60% of our production comes from grower families in the Barossa, a lot of them 5th and 6th generation. And we've used that to employ young kids off local farms. So we're actively employing under a traineeship program and training them in viticulture. And it's certainly nice to, with the wines that we sell, there's a bit of prestige in that, and it's certainly great to encourage the next generation to understand the value of these old vines. And certainly sustainable practices are, in our region, in Barossa, a lot of these farming families, as land managers, there is a real an incentive to look after your property. And, our motto is to try and leave our vineyards in a better condition than we found them. So, again, we're really trying to invest back into not only our vineyards, but also the people that we've got there. And, one of our winemakers, Scott, came out of school, did a vintage, and he actually, the old vines here at Hillside, one of his first jobs was to cut the old vines off. They were actually trellised. So we've actually gone back to a bush vine in this particular vineyard because we really like the shape in a bush vine, protects the fruit from the hot sun. So again, our Lindok vineyard is the furthest south that we have, and it's a little bit higher rainfall, but it's a westerly facing aspect. So again, it gets a lot of hot sun. So we're really looking at the shape of the vine, as well as the variety. I mean, Grenache is a wonderful variety for the Barossa Valley, and so is Shiraz.
I was going to ask you that, and we've also got a question from Simon Woods, and it was one of the questions that we actually discussed last week, and that's, you know, the difference between Shiraz and Grenache, or even Mourvedre, in terms of their water requirements. And, you know, recently with, for example, in South Africa, there's some quite interesting views about how those grape varieties react differently to water regime. Perhaps you can talk to some of that.
Certainly, I think Grenache is a very is able to close its stomata when there's very hot conditions and there's a lot of evapotranspiration. So, you know, Grenache as a dry grown variety is actually very well suited to that condition, you know, for that that trait. Whereas Shiraz I think, is not as good at controlling its stomata and the water loss through the stomata, but is a vigorous variety. So a lot of our old vineyards are some of our most productive, but some of the root systems can go up to 12 metres in diameter. So they're 1850 Shiraz at Hillside. It'll go down, hits the clay, and it really spreads out. So rather than being able to moderate the amount of water it's losing, it's actually able to draw moisture from depth. So, you know, a lot of the time, you know, our philosophy around looking after our soils, building up soil health, is to enable that vine and hold as much water in the soil, because that vine can draw moisture from depth as well. So if you can imagine a 12-metre wide root system is like a big pump. So our clay, we have a lot of clay soils in the Barossa, very old soils. You know, those soils also hold a lot of moisture. So if we have a normal winter and spring, the vines are able to get through the hot periods, and, you know, often we'll get a summer rain, which will just get them through to harvest. So again, the varieties that we're growing actually are ideally suited. And I guess the reason the old vineyards are there today is that they are adapted to our climate.
Actually, and whilst you're here, as Sue's not here, and we're going to move on to her Wynns, the Coonawarra Black Label Cabernet Sauvignon, perhaps you could say a few words about how Cabernet reacts as a grape variety and the difference. You know, obviously Coonawarra is a cooler region. Actually, Sue mentioned last week that these are from dry farmed Cabernet Sauvignon grapes, but obviously the soils are generally more shallow in Coonawarra. Perhaps you can give us a sense of how Cabernet reacts under these different conditions.
Yeah, I think, you know, Coonawarra has also got, and Wynns particularly, have got some older vineyards. So again, I think if you look at the red terrarossa soils, they're actually very friable and very well structured soils. And what you would generally see is that the root zone is maybe only 50 centimetres down to limestone, but the vine's able to really explore all of that soil, and they're very, very productive soils. So there's good nutrient there and water holding capacity. But again, those soils, the structure of those soils is exceptional. So in that classic Coonawarra strip, the vines are able to really explore the full gamut of soil that they have. And being a little bit more summer rainfall and a bit higher rainfall, you know, that certainly helps the Cabernet produce very varietal wines. Whereas in the Barossa, we probably tend to get a little bit hotter with Cabernet, and you don't tend to get that, the methoxypyrazine type characters that we get, or that they get in the Coonawarra.
Great, thank you. Clinton, perhaps we could come on to talk a little bit about Clare Valley and Wakefield wines.
Sure.
So before we talk about the wine itself, just going back to the topic of sustainability, and, you know, Wakefield, or Taylor's as you're called in Australia, has done a huge amount of sustainability initiatives, just like everybody else on the call, but slightly different in that you have committed to science-based targets, which not everyone may be aware of. Perhaps you can just describe a little bit about what they are and what your commitments are, and what led you to go down that route, as well as being part of Sustainable Winegrowing Australia.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, well, science. So I think we think we're one of the first, if not the first, winery in Australia to sign up to science-based targets, and this is a scheme driven off the back of the Paris Protocol, Copenhagen, and recent times Glasgow, and it's a collaboration between the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And really all that's what it's about is working out your footprint. So what we're aiming to do is cut our scope 1 and 2 emissions that we can control by 50% by 2030. So yeah, we thought, being a family company, I'm part of the third generation, and we reckon we'll go generational, that we definitely wanted to do something within the company and throughout the business to mitigate our impact on climate. So what you're doing there essentially is you're looking at your footprint there. So a lot of your scope 1 and 2 emissions, so your fuels that you're using, electricity, fertilizers in the vineyards, and then you're working on, so you get a base rate of where you're at, and then you've got to look to reduce that. So we've done things along the lines of solar power. We put in solar, LED lighting, green power. In our sales team, we've got sales departments in Australia, so we're looking to move from hybrid cars to fully electric over time. So doing things in that space to reduce our emissions. And then what you've got to do is, so you get third party endorsed on the project, and you send that off to the people at Science Based Targets, and then you've got to report annually on how you're going against those projects. So that's over, as I said, that's over a period of time. So, you know, as I said, 50% reduction in our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. So that's one there. Another thing we're doing, I'll show you a couple of things we're doing at Wakefield Wines. We've got involved with, we've done a good trial and getting right behind, see how that comes out. That's a PET plastic bottle. So we're doing a trial with that now. So yeah, some of the good sort of numbers on
let's talk a little bit more about that. So that is the Pacamama bottle, which is made from recycled PET, I think, actually.
Yeah, that's probably. Oh, sorry, go, Jane.
So you've just talked about your aims for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but I guess we're now moving on to scope 3. So those are all those things upstream and downstream from the vineyard and winery that create greenhouse gas emissions. And as I'm sure everyone is aware, packaging and glass bottles in particular can be quite heavy. They're quite energy intensive to produce. So there are, you know, opportunities to reduce scope 3 emissions through looking at alternative formats. I guess that's what's been your driving factor here, is that aim to try and bring down greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like this bottle's about 63 grams, and your bottles sort of fluctuate, your glass bottles fluctuate from, well, anywhere from 360 grams through to, you know, the more premium ones are up at 500 plus. So it's got real benefits in not only the packaging, so you can get on a pallet, you'll get through the configuration.
Oh, I think we've lost
Duration here. You got me?
You cut out slightly. Maybe you just need to repeat that bit. I think you were talking about the configuration, the fact that they're flat pack, they're lighter, that you can get more into a case and onto a pallet, but perhaps repeat it. Yeah, sure. So just like on a pallet when you're trucking it around or shipping it, you can get you'll get about 580 litres of wine on a pallet in glass, where with these guys you'll get up around the 860 litres on a pallet.
and things like, and probably the big thing that you touched on, Jane, was the fact that these bottles are really, recycled regularly. So it's not like they're being, a fresh plastic bottle. It's fact that they find with the studies that they're continually getting recycled. So about 80, I think I'm told 87% of PET is recycled back into a new container, but it's recycled plastic. Where in the glass,
high. I have to.
It's more.
That's amazing. If that is the case, that's amazing. That would make Australia one of the highest recyclers, I think, of PET bottles ever anywhere. But I think it's absolutely brilliant project. So has this actually launched in Australia already, or are you at a trial stage, or where are you at with it?
No, that we've got that out in retail currently. Yeah.
And it's been well received?
Yeah, so that's been big yours.
Sorry, you cut out slightly there.
Sorry, what was that, Jack?
Has it been well received?
Yeah, it's been well received. So sorry about the delay there. Yeah, it's been well received. I think people like the convenience of it, and definitely the environmental message that is good, and it's good, smart packaging. And you get great benefits through the transport chain with how light it is and how much more product you can get from A to B. So it's been well received at this stage, very much so.
Great. Perhaps we come back to the wine. So we got the St Andrews Shiraz 2018. Would you like to pass some comments on that? And perhaps going back to the earlier question that Nigel answered in his views about Shiraz, Grenache, and other varieties. What's your view of Shiraz in Clare Valley?
Well, it's interesting. I was sort of looking back over the last 20 years. We've found that on our property, our rainfalls dropped back about 17% through the growing season. And through like September to April, the growing season, but the phenology of the wine and when it's been ready to pick and what have you, that's really fluctuating because it's controlled by the temperature, and it's really fluctuating with the weather patterns. So we certainly find, so when we look at, as I said, rainfall down over 20 years, about 17%. But if you look at the graph on temperature, it's up and down based on, we're sort of reading it as with the weather patterns like your La Nina and El Nino, and the season started slower with La Nina, so we're having colder starts. A slower start, whereas with the El Nino, it's a warmer, earlier start. So yeah, really on the weather patterns, how it's being dictated with the picking cycle when we looked at our Shiraz in particular at our winery. But real fluctuation, and I think as the group we sort of talked about fluctuation in the weather behaviour, as we were talking before. So we're certainly seeing that in our vineyard. Look, on the whole, we sort of think Clare's got a fairly Mediterranean climate. So when I looked at the vintage, this one's a 2018. That was a nice vintage. We had only like 4 days of over 40-degree heat, which is unusual. And we had the biggest variation from day to night was like 23 degrees in our vineyard. So that was an interesting stat. But it was, cool nights and a dry summer. So made for a really, excellent vintage 18. But yeah, look, Shiraz on the whole is fairly weather tolerant. We find in the valley, as I said, it's with temperature, it's more the extremes of it, and the Shiraz varietal seems to be able manage it and push through to a large degree.
Great, thank you. We have a quick question here from Liz saying, do you increase price of wine if in PET bottle? Is there a price differential between them, glass and PET?
No, we haven't. No, we've just trialled with a retailer who's going on a existing product that we have in glass as well, so it's just the same price.
Great. And there's a question that Simon asked earlier, which I'll perhaps put to all of the panel. Are there any stats as to how many wine drinkers are concerned about sustainability? Well, I haven't seen any specific stats. I know that Wine Intelligence has actually been monitoring people's views on sustainability in its widest sense, looking at things like propensity to purchase organic or biodynamic wines. But we know virtually every single consumer survey that you look at these days, whether it's wine or just general retail customers, they're all concerned about sustainability, even though they might not fully understand its widest sense in all products and may be focused on one particular part of sustainability. But I'll throw it open to anyone there, and just even anecdotally, you know, in your cellar doors, in your experience, in the trade that you do, the customers that you come across, how do you think consumers are moving in terms of sustainability? Who'd like to go first?
Jane, I think I'll jump in. I think largely it's about how you tell your story and how you might involve them in terms of the purpose behind what you're doing and what you see as your vision for doing it. I think there's probably a little bit of overuse of it. I've certainly probably found the biggest benefit for us has been in this environment, in the trade environment, in terms of, you know, sort of knocking and opening on doors. And I think we all hope that, you know, that will eventually flow through to the consumer. But I think more and more they're more driven by purpose and alignment around their values, and they don't get caught up in the science or the certification side of it. That's just my personal view.
Giles from Alliance Wine. I mean, you've got customers, trade customers. You're in contact with people all the time. Do you see any movement from consumers? Or is Giles frozen? I think he may have frozen. Sorry.
Can I add something?
Melissa, please do.
Yeah. So look, I think we do get people seeking us out for our organic credentials, but I think more importantly in the wine industry that we are in a very unique position where we are able to communicate directly with our customers about sustainability and what we're doing and what they can do to minimise detrimental impact on the environment. You know, because people come to cellar doors, and whereas if I was selling vegetables or beef or, you know, I wouldn't have that opportunity to communicate with my customers that we have in wine. So I almost see it as a responsibility to communicate our message to people and to spread the word to help the environment.
Great, thank you. We have a question here that was actually posed earlier on, but I was waiting till Clinton showed his Pacamama bottle, really, before I raised this question. But it's a question again to all of you. So we've seen the Pacamama bottle, but obviously, you know, PET may not be the most appropriate packaging for all wines that everyone produces. But there is a question here about, to what extent have you all evaluated sustainability / environmental impacts of your round glass wine bottles? Has anyone, Clinton's already talked a little bit about what they're doing there. Could anyone else talk to packaging a little bit about how you see that going forwards?
Yeah, well, we've certainly we're doing stuff with the plastic now, but also lightweight glass, which was, you know, good initiative. It's funny in the wine industry at times, you got to, it's a fashion game as well. And at times the the retailers can really feel that they need, heavyweight bottles of wine and what have you. So sometimes you're pushing a little bit against your morals and what have you. But certainly with the PET bottle and lightweight glass, it's been very well received by the gatekeepers at times, and the public are, as Melissa said, but the public are interested and do want to know and are keen to support those stories. So we've found it very positive.
Great. And there is another question here about the PET bottle, about does it have an impact on the quality of the wine versus a glass bottle? Perhaps you want to talk to that, but maybe I'll just add that I think, all wines, we need to think about the longevity, how long they're going to be kept for. PET is great for certain wines. Perhaps if you're talking about a wine like some of the ones that we've been tasting, that will be kept, have already been kept 2018, 2019, several years. Perhaps PET is not the way to go for those. Clinton, did you do any sort of life trials or anything like that before you launched this bottle?
Yeah, we've done some trials, and our understanding is we're sort of moving. We're going with the fast moving SKUs that we think will be consumed sort of within 24 hours to 48 hours of purchase.
So we're talking about 18 months sort of from filling to consumers consuming the wine.
That's roughly what we're working on.
Nigel, you wanted to say something.
I'm not expert on packaging, but I know that we certainly have our own proprietary bottle, but we have tried to limit the amount of glass that we use. And we still use cork closures because it is actually a natural product. The corks we use are very expensive, but again, we have tried to limit the amount of glass that we're using, but still stick true to our proprietary bottle. And we've got good relationship with the glass suppliers to be able to do that. So, I'm not sure I could sell lead in a plastic bottle, but it's I think it's very specific about what variety and wine style you're doing.
Yeah. Great. Mike has asked, are there many initiatives on water recycling schemes within the wineries themselves? Is anyone sort of capturing the water in the winery, recycling it, treating it and using it in vineyards? Melissa, you're nodding your head. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we do. So we treat the wastewater from the winery. We put it back out in the vineyard, and we also heavily rely on recycled water to irrigate our vineyards. As a lot of McLaren Vale vineyards use recycled water, which is a fantastic initiative because it's taking wastewater that would otherwise be going out to sea and turning it into something economically useful. Great initiative.
It goes back to your conversation at the beginning about composting and having this sort of closed entity where everything is used as many times as efficiently as possible and minimizing any sort of waste or pollution that is generated.
Exactly. I think we should all be thinking about the waste that we're generating and how we can make that into something useful. Sorry, Nigel, you go.
We're similar. We at the winery, all our winery waste is recycled with Tarek Technologies, and we actually get that water back to use on our vineyard and orchards and an olive grove as well. And I guess that's one of the things that we're looking at our dry growing vineyards. We're actually trying to use less water. So everything that we're trying to do is actually about really trying to maximise the flavour and the intensity of our wines, but by not adding more. So again, all our mark and stuff goes through Tarek Technologies as well and gets reused. So it's it's in your best interest to be able to do that, but not always possible because you're not always close to a recycling plant. But we're lucky enough to have that here.
Great. Well, we're running sort of quite tight on time now. We've got 5 minutes left. Perhaps I'm just going to go around the panel each individually to ask you one last comment about, your thoughts on sustainability. Some of these goals about trying to achieve net zero. What are the easy wins that we should all be trying to get after, and what are some of the challenges that we need to spend a little bit more time on? developing solutions to. So I'm going to ask you one by one. Nigel, you've got your mic on, so I'll start with you. Perhaps.
Look, I think, you know, sustainability is fundamental to what we do, and you know, we want to leave our land in a better condition, and then that's what we aspire to do. I think the really thing for us is about, you know, really understanding your soils and the terroir that we work in, because we've got a range, so many different types of soil. We cannot blanket manage them. So we have a different management strategy for all. You know, we have white sands, black clays, red clays, you know, all sorts of different things. And we don't take a blanket approach, but wherever we can, we try to minimise our footprint on that land.
Great, thank you. Giles? We can't hear you, I'm afraid, Giles. We can't hear you. Perhaps I'll ask Clinton whilst you try and sort out your microphone.
Yeah, sure. And I think a good thing in this space is to put a bit of pressure on your business partners. And like we talk about Scope 3 emissions and things like that. We're sort of a medium-sized company, so we're more and more encouraging conversation with suppliers of, you know, labels, bottles, and what have you, to, you know, do what are they doing in this space? What can we do more together so we can continually improve? Because it gets harder after you get to some of the low-hanging fruit and do your solar, your panels, and change your lighting and what have you. It's hard to continually improve, but I think there's lots of things that can be done through technology and partnering with you know, suppliers and throughout the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely key as well. The wine trade is just this huge network, and when you think about the amount of wine that's going from one country or one region to another country, and we're all invested in making sure that it's as sustainable as possible. So I don't think it's just down to vineyards and wineries. It's got to be down to all of us in the trade, whether we're buying and selling wines, retailing them, writing about them, whatever. I think that's a really good point. Thank you. Giles, are you now on microphone? Can we hear you? Can you try again? No, I'm afraid I can't hear you. So I'm going to go to Malcolm.
Thanks, Jane. I'm sorry. I'd love to hear what Giles.
I'm sure he'll be back before the end.
I think that's a good point. I think doing more of this, I've learnt so much tonight myself, just through sharing in a forum. I guess we'd probably put our farmers' hat on and say that, you know, sustainability, we really hope flows back to the growers and the farmers, and that they can continue to invest in what they're doing. And I think importantly at a farm level, we need to, you know, think about taking yield out of the equation a bit more, and focusing on, you know, right plants for right environment, and showcasing you know, regional characters and a premium around everything that we do.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, look, I agree with what everybody said. Yeah, I've loved joining in this conversation. I think for me, biodiversity is a really key part of sustainability. And, you know, one thing I've learned is that monocultures are essentially, they're dysfunctional. You know, you need biodiversity to create a healthy ecosystem. The more different plant species that you have on your land, they actually have different microbiomes that cooperate with each other, that then naturally release nutrients to the crop that you're trying to grow. And so biodiversity is a really important part of sustainability. I could say so much more, but I'll just stop.
And I think that biodiversity also, it's about, you know, the photosynthesis of all those different plants, capturing CO2, sequestering the carbon in the soils, creating that biodiversity. It actually helps all of us as well, not just your vineyards, but it's actually helping the world get to its you know, zero carbon targets, hopefully, Giles, I'm going to give you one last go. Let's please, fingers crossed. Can you hear us?
Can
we
people
hear
hear me now?
It works. Thank you.
Thanks. And all the way through, it said that my mic's on, so I don't know what was going on. What I was going to say was I think the Sustainable Wine Australia platform is great in that it gives everybody the opportunity to at least start on the process. And I think everybody sometimes gets put off the whole subject of sustainability because it's perceived that you have to be good from the start, but everybody has to start from somewhere. And because you're measuring continually, you're able to demonstrate to your own business and to others that you are actually making progress. And earlier we were talking about glass, and we changed the glass on one line that we did last year, and by global standards it's tiny, but that saved us 17 tons of glass on just one wine, just by making a move to a slightly lighter weight bottle, which nobody noticed and all of our customers have accepted. So it's very easy to demonstrate very quickly that you can make a change. And I think one of the other things that we all need to remember, that sustainability is not just about mitigating the bad that we do to the environment or to the world, but it should be about the positive impact that we can make as well. And I think all of us in our own way are making a very positive impact to the communities around us. And I think it's really important that there's industry leadership from whether it's Sustainable Wine Australia or it's the people we're trying to sell to, setting ever tougher kind of targets that we have to try and meet to be able to sell into those customers as well, which keeps us on our toes as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have to stop there. I could go on for hours. You know me, I love talking about sustainability and all the exciting things that are happening. I just go back to Giles's point, actually. I think it's important to make a start, and I think Sustainable Winegrowing Australia is a great tool. It's a certification for consumers, but it's a great tool for everyone in the Australian wine industry as well to sort of monitor performance and to make a start. And as I said earlier on, sustainability is not something you ever actually achieve. It's something that you constantly are striving for and adapting to and getting better at. So the important key is to start, as Giles said. So with that, I thank all of you for participating. So sorry that Sue couldn't be here. And Sue, I'm so sorry I didn't spend so much time talking about Wynns because we had so many different topics of conversations. Thank you to all the participants and attendees for your questions. I hope we've answered most of them in the main. If there are any few bits and pieces, then we'll come back to you. So without that, I shall say goodbye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Jane. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Jane. Are we all signing off now? Is that it? We don't need it.